Hi, this is Richard Edelman, and you're listening to the Trust Makers.
Hi, I'm Justin Blake, Executive Director of the Edelman Trust Institute, Edelman's global research center and learning laboratory dedicated to the study and building of trust across institutions. This week, we're joined by Sandra Sucher to discuss some of the findings from our recently released 2022 Edelman Trust Barometer. Sandra is Professor of Management Practice at Harvard Business School, and her book, The Power of Trust: How Companies Build It, Lose It, Regain It, was released last summer and is soon to be released in China. We are so pleased to have her also on the advisory board of the Edelman Trust Institute. Sandra, welcome to the Trust Makers.
Oh, Justin, thank you so much. Thank you.
Sandra, you literally wrote the book on trust. Let's start with your story and how you became interested in this topic.
Sure. So Justin, if you picture a hotel lobby in Tokyo, and I'm sitting there with Shalin Gupta, who is my co-author and research associate, and we had come to Japan to study a company called Recruit Holdings. And when we were there, we found that Recruit had survived a scandal that was so great that the Prime Minister of Japan and his entire cabinet had to resign as a result of it. 159 people got swept up in it. And now they're a $20 billion global corporation. And so as the business person in me just said, how can that be possible? I thought trust once lost could never be regained. And certainly not to that point. So this contradicted everything I'd ever thought about trust in business. And so that's why I started to kind of set out to study how it is that trust is built, how it's lost, and how it's recovered. I must say I also came to this kind of from the standpoint of my own background. So I grew up in Detroit. My high schools, all my schools were public schools, half Black and half Jewish. So I had a very interesting and different perspective on what the world was like. And from the earliest age, I had been thinking about how do you build environments in which people who are different from each other can actually respect each other, get along, and do great things together. So that's always animated my work. And trust has become sort of the latest place where I do that.
That's terrific. Talk to us then a little bit about some of the foundations of trust in your work. What have you found?
So the most surprising finding actually is the definition. So trust is a willingness to be vulnerable to the actions and intentions of others. So when we trust, we are showing other people that we allow them to have power over us as customers, as employees, members of communities. And it's our willingness to be vulnerable that creates the relationship. So let me use a quick example. If you can think back to getting your COVID vaccination, if you got one, this was a moment where you knew how vulnerable you were to the competence of the people who were both administering and developing the vaccine. You were counting on being treated with a certain degree of care because it's scary. And you definitely counted on the impact of all of this to be positive. So I think all of us have recently experienced this moment of vulnerability, and it gives us more personal insight into what it's like to trust.
Vulnerability is one of those things where I can very much understand it in a relationship point of view. But how does a corporation express vulnerability?
So let me be clear. The corporation is not the unit of analysis. When you study trust, what you're worried about, what you think about is whether your stakeholders trust you. So the focus is always on their perspective. What can you do to help them make this willingness to be vulnerable? And so, for example, if you look at even a company like Uber, right, a service that we're all quite familiar with and in some cases use frequently, it kind of shows us that when we build trust in a company, it's not just based on one thing. Right. So with Uber, they are hugely competent. They wrote the book on ride hailing. And so when we trust them, we do that because we know they've got this amazing system. We get in a car, we get to where we need to go, no money changes hands. None of that existed before Uber. Right. So the foundation of trust between an individual and an organization is always competence.
In the case of Uber, I know you, in your book, you talked about how then they slipped, but there are ways they were able to regain trust as well. Is that related to their strong perception of competence?
It is eventually, but it was a very rocky road. Right. And so, another dimension on which we trust is whether we trust the motives of the company that we do business with. And so, for a while, there were stories in 2017 or so, 2013, it started about an accident that an Uber driver had in San Francisco, killed a little girl, injured the mother and brother. Family takes Uber to court. And Uber in court claims that the driver really wasn't an Uber employee. At the time of the accident, he didn't have an Uber passenger in his car, and he hadn't as yet accepted his next ride. So when we step back and say, can we trust this company? One thing that seems to be true is that they really don't seem to care about the interests of other people beyond their own. Now, no company is at their best in a lawsuit. And in a courtroom. So I would be the last person to judge them solely on that dimension. But it's a great example of how people kind of step back and said, well, so who are these guys? And whose interests do they really care about?
Yeah. So you've talked about vulnerability. You've talked about competence. You've talked about motives. Are there other key elements of trust?
Yeah, so there are two more. And the first of them is means, which is a way of sort of saying, is the company fair in how they treat people? So at one point, there was a company, it was Uber, that had a policy that said that if you were a person living with disabilities, if you took more than 2 minutes to get into a car, they charged you for the extra wait time. And now, when this policy came to light, there was such universal outrage at the rank unfairness of treating people that way, charging them more based on something they can't control. And so the question of are you fair in how you treat others is a dimension. And the last dimension is actually the dimension of impact. So there's a lot of emphasis right now, but deservedly so, on companies needing to have strong purpose. For my book, I want a company to care about its impact. The real on the ground, what happens as a result of what I do actions. And in this regard, Uber, like all ride hailing companies, has kind of a mixed record. So early on, you remember all the concerns that people had about too many cars on the road, what was happening to congestion on city streets. And then during the pandemic, people said, well, can they keep their passengers safe? Can they keep their employees safe? So what they were being measured on at that point was the actual impact that their business had. So those are the four dimensions: competence, motives, means, and impact. And I think the takeaway for people is that trust isn't just one thing. When you're trusted for certain reasons, and you may not be trusted for others. And so that's important. There was a kind of a kicker to the story with Uber. So it basically started with 90% of the ride hailing market. And is now in a position of having about 68%. Lyft has filled the other 32%, largely, one would argue, by not being Uber. And so it's kind of an opening.
So do you think that opening occurred because of a trust erosion with Uber? Do you think this was tied to Uber and trust?
Right. So, if this were a visual dimension and not just, oral, I could show you the graph to the share of market. And sort of when this shift occurred. And part of it was just having a good competitor enter the field, but another was people's great concerns about the ways that Uber had been behaving in the past.
This seems like a good moment then to talk about what got you interested originally, which is this idea of the ability to regain trust. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the Recruit Holdings example or use Uber as an example of how recoverable is trust once you've lost it or it's eroded.
I think that the headline here is that lost trust can be regained. So people who say, throw up our hands, game over, that's not true. It's not easy, but it turns out there's kind of a reliable process for recovering lost trust. And I'll use Recruit as the example. So the first thing that you have to do is you have to acknowledge the harm that you've created. And so that's the first step. And so the story of that scandal that I talked about before, that's still on Recruit's website. Right, you can see what happened in the late 1980s, what they did, and how it transformed the company. So the first thing is and people want to know that you've done something wrong. That's how you start rebuilding trust, is by the communication of that. The step two is that you do have to take accountability. Now, in this case, society took accountability. And so the CEO who created this scandal went to jail, as did a number of other people for that matter. But even inside the company, you have to just make sure that people are held to account. Doesn't mean you fire them, but the people are responsible for the effects of their actions. And then the third step is you have to kind of go in and fix the thing that is a result of the trust breach. So it turns out in Recruit's case, customers still love them. They thought that problem with the CEO, that doesn't affect us. Their employees were having a problem. It was now a mark of shame to work at Recruit. And so what they then started to do was a years-long effort to create a culture of being a good place to be from. So they said, you don't have to work here forever, but while you're here, you have to get great value out of being here. And so they did a number of things: reward innovation, give people flexibility to follow passion projects, educate them. And so that was the trust problem they ended up needing to solve. It was surprising because it wasn't necessarily with their customers, but that's the way that trust recovery works.
And I guess in the case of Recruit, what's some of the proof that those actions worked?
So, I think the fact that they're a $20 billion corporation, that's the same size revenues as Salesforce. They have 50,000 employees worldwide. At this point, they actually own both Indeed and Glassdoor. And so they have learned how to become both a responsible business and one that continues to innovate, which is always something they had been good at. Yeah. So, to me, it's kind of like, look at these guys. They're a great stock. Everything about them is excellent.
With your expertise on trust, I'm very curious about your take on the 2022 Trust Barometer, which we released recently. Is there any finding that particularly jumped out at you from the Trust Barometer?
So I think that the Trust Barometer actually did what a barometer is supposed to do. It wasn't just a measurement. It showed something happening that we weren't aware of. And so in the Trust Barometer, you showed that the circles of trust were shrinking, that people actually became more and more likely to trust their neighbors, their community, and less likely to trust people outside of their known domain. I think, unfortunately, world events have proved how prescient that was in terms of this notion that I can only trust locally. And so I think understanding that has implications, obviously, for those of us in business and how we can leverage that and work with our communities and inside this kind of smaller footprint to really reinforce trust. But that struck me as one of the most interesting and sort of forward-looking notions about who do I trust and why.
Yeah, well, this proximity of trust question is something that we're really noticing a lot recently. And, to give a very tangible example of that, people, yes, business is the most trusted institution, but way more trusted is my employer. And my CEO is also much more trusted than a generic CEO. I wonder what your reaction is to some of those findings and some of the implications for business and for CEOs.
Yeah, so, I think the headline is good news in my company, right? And this means I have a platform that is even stronger than I had before. People having expectations for me, what I'll do and how I'll help our company move forward. I think the dissatisfaction with CEOs as a class has more to do with dissatisfaction of the fruits of globalization and capitalism. And so I think that, CEOs are being held as kind of standard bearers for all that has come to stand for, and looked at as the people who should be blamed for the fact that this is not a system in which everyone is flourishing.
So part of the blame perhaps to CEOs also has to be that then they're not trusted as a class. Are there lessons you gave those trust recovery recommendations for corporations and leaders? Are those somehow tied a bit as well to what CEOs in general could be doing day in and day out to build more trust or regain trust?
So I think that for CEOs, the most difficult challenge they face is determining which trust issues crossing their desk should they pay attention to. So CEOs are now being held accountable for systemic issues like racism, climate change, the pandemic, and then they have local issues that reflect what's going on in their own businesses. And so we actually have some marvelous examples, I think, of CEOs who kind of understand how to step into that space. So someone, like a Mark Benioff at Salesforce, actually went out and contested the Indiana bathroom law. He said, I've got employees in this state. This is not good for them. And so it was a kind of a surgical attack, meaning it wasn't like I care about everybody and everything. I'm doing this because of my employees. So I think that CEOs actually have a great opportunity to really be thoughtful about which of these issues matter most to their key stakeholders and which ones they actually pay attention to.
You mentioned this as an opportunity for CEOs, but also when I hear the kind of litany of things that they're almost being held responsible for, major societal issues like climate change, for example, but also, as you said earlier, issues with capitalism, like that seems like quite a lot to put on a CEO's plate in terms of what they're meant to be addressing.
So here's a data point that may help sort of show why that may be fair. One of the issues that I think sits behind a lot of this is the concern actually over CEO pay and sort of how much are you getting for how much work you do compared to the people who work for you. And so if you take a look at a company like Amazon, going into 2021, they had a profitability increase of like 84%. The new average salary for an Amazon employee was $29,000 a year. The new CEO coming in was going to earn $36 million. That's like 1,200 times the average monthly salary of the people who do the work that we count on. And I think that, CEOs are not passive victims here. They can actually play a role in sort of how their compensation is designed, what they're paid for, how big it is. Yes, there's a market for CEOs and all of that, but I think a lack of attention to that difference is part of what drives people's concern and this record trust gap between high and low income earners, because people say, well, that's simply not fair.
Yeah, I think you're right. But what I kind of find surprising is that the pitchforks don't seem to be precisely targeted to that issue. Like, I'm actually surprised that this dissonance between highest level CEO pay and average worker pay, it certainly comes up, but it doesn't feel like the prime focus of a lot of kind of the discourse right now. But I'm also curious, as a company, most of the defense is around the inability to do this unilaterally. So how do you start building trust around pay equity, CEO pay, when there are a lot of companies that say, oh, if we suddenly change our CEO pay scheme, we're no longer competitive in terms of finding a CEO?
So here's a point in time example. So during the Great Recession, Honeywell actually, decided to use furloughs instead of layoffs in order to maintain an intact workforce. And during that period of time, Dave Cote refused a bonus. Right. He said, you know what, he said, I feel like I'm working hard. That's not the issue. It's what I'm asking other people to do. And so that's not a systemic fix, right? That's a point in time example. But I think that sensitivity around this issue, and I agree with you, so you will see a flurry of articles about this in about a month as CEO pay numbers start to come out. And it happens every year and people are outraged briefly. I think the example I was using was more as an indicator to make sure that CEOs try to close the gap between themselves and other people. I think as leaders, that's the big challenge, is how to make sure that I continue to see the world the way my customers see it, the way my employees see it, the way the communities are where I do business. That's how you build trust, is being able to take other people's perspective into account.
And so you mentioned the example of the CEO of Honeywell. Do you see this as a trend? Are more CEOs doing what you suggest in terms of taking some of those other perspectives into account as they look at their pay packages? Are boards looking at this more? Is this a growing topic in boardrooms from what you hear?
Now, I have not seen attention to this in the boardroom issues that people seem to be paying attention to. That conversation is much more squarely focused on ESG. And it would come through the S element of that if it did at all. Actually, it's a governance issue. It's a G problem. So I haven't heard much focus on that for a number of, I think, intelligent and understandable reasons. But I do think that this question of how it is that boards and companies can tune into the interests and concerns of the people who they want to have trust them, I think that's actually the thrust of my comments here.
Yeah, so a lot of what you've talked about is kind of listening to your stakeholders, but also I inferred earlier, kind of prioritizing some of your stakeholders. What should boards, what should C-suite leaders and others be doing to help better understand, first of all, what their stakeholders even want, and then how to prioritize them?
Right. So, and this is a balancing act that is arguably the hardest part of the CEO and the board job. Right. Nothing is actually harder than trying to figure out at any given point in time for any important decision, whose interest should we be paying attention to? And so if you go back for just a second to the Honeywell example, when Dave Cote did those furloughs, he was very clear, communicated to everybody, I'm going to prioritize my customers first. If I'm going to make it through this recession, they have to feel well taken care of. And in order to do that, I'm going to trade off the interests of my investors and my employees. No one's going to be completely satisfied with what I'm going to do here, but I'm going to actually do both of those things in order to protect the customer. So I think it's that kind of a willingness to kind of dig in and say, here's how I'm going to address this, that I think the board conversation with CEOs needs to look like.
So in terms of prioritization of stakeholders, for the first time, we've recently seen that respondents on the Trust Barometer believe that employees are a company's most important stakeholder, more important than customers. Is the fact that that's what the general public is telling us, should that have an impact on how leaders prioritize their stakeholders, and especially about prioritization of employees?
I think that should actually be influencing decisions. And this is not us talking. Every company on the planet is trying to figure out how to get the people that it needs, hang on to them and develop and grow them. So this sense of employees being a critical component is something, this is a kind of a rare moment in time in business for this to emerge as a trend. And I think it's really important for people to pay attention to all the data points that are coming out about this. People voluntarily leaving, some without even a new job in place, others for just $1 or so more an hour. Right. So there's lots of signaling that the current contract that we have with our employees is in many ways not working for them.
So if you look at the Great Resignation, does that lead to a scenario where in the balance of stakeholders, things get too balanced to try to cater to your employees in order to keep them and incentivize them?
To me, because I'm a customer first kind of a thinker, I find it hard to over prioritize employees. So one of the biggest findings from our research is trust is built from the inside out. It's almost impossible to be trusted by people outside your organization if you're not trusted by the people inside of it. And so I think that just seems to be what happens in order to build a flourishing business. And so, yes, can it go too far? But guess what? It has gone too far in the other direction for decades. And so there's a lot of ground to be made up. I think we should start to worry about over-indexing on the interests of employees.
I'm pleased to hear you say that and definitely agree. I'm curious what you're looking at in the future in terms of trust. Like, are there certain areas of inquiry that you want to get deeper into? Are there certain things that you're looking at now? What's next for you on the topic of trust?
Yes, so I've got two areas that I'm focused on. One is in increasing attention to the role of the CEO, of the leader, in building trust. And I've gotten more interested in finding out more about kind of the interpersonal dimensions of trust, what it is that people can be doing in their interactions that builds trust, because there's a capability side of this that I think is critical for CEOs to get good at. Don't know exactly how it works, and so that's an arena of study. Another is I'm actually quite interested in the role of corporate boards in establishing the conditions within which companies are able to work on these issues. So it's at the board level that we're having all the debates about ESG, what kind, how much to pay for it, how to allocate our resources against it. And so I think that sort of how boards and CEOs interact, what it is that goes on to build conditions for working on trust, I feel like that's a really fruitful line of inquiry as well.
And what are you seeing in terms of boards and trust? Like, one of the things that strikes me in the work that we do is that boards are actually talking about trust in the first place, and that is a new development.
Right. And I think that ESG has kind of led people there. It's a great example of a stakeholder-driven issue that all of a sudden makes the board pay attention to the way that people think outside the firm. So in terms of structure, the board is like this pivot between the external world and the internal business. And so they are always supposed to be the arbiter of translating what's going on in the outside into terms that make sense for the business that they work on. So that's what I think is happening. And I think it's been extremely fruitful. The people I talk with are frustrated. They're not sure exactly how to go after this because it's a big terrain. But I think their attention is extremely positive.
And I'm also really fascinated by you starting to look more at interpersonal trust. And I'm kind of curious, how does that get extrapolated to trust between institutions and companies and their stakeholders? What's some of your thinking on that?
So it started with a funny moment actually related to my teaching. And it had to do with the question of what does it mean to assume good intent? And this was an issue that had emerged as I was teaching it. It made me start to think about that there are some preconditions for how it is that you need to be able to work with each other in order to have conversations about difficult things. And so actually that's the path that I've been going down, is to start to think about how such a common assumption that we all make about how do you have a difficult conversation, which is to assume good intent, and what impact that would have if we could operationalize that so it helps CEOs to be better interacting inside the organization, helps them work with their boards. And so I feel like there's something in there. So you're now talking to a researcher very early in the game. And so I'm going to kind of struggle here to describe. I feel like there's a there. I can't really be clear on exactly what it is.
Well, I'll be excited, and I'm sure we'll all be excited to hear what you come up with here. The one thing I will say on this count is it does feel like when there is trust within colleagues in any situation, there's just an efficiency. So if you start with that kind of assumption that you're in a trusted space, things move better, things move quicker. There's a real ease to working together. So my sense is you're onto something, and we'll be excited to see what you come up with.
That's a great connection, because I think you're right. It's one of the reasons people like trust is that it's efficient. I need to document less. I need to contract less because all of a sudden we have a way of working together. So I agree with that.
That's all the time we have for today, Sandra. Thank you for coming on the show and sharing your insights and expertise. And to our listeners, thank you for listening to The Trust Makers.
Thank you for tuning into The Trust Makers, an Edelman podcast in partnership with Advertising Week, where we speak with leaders and other trust builders across institutions. See you next time.